Hello everyone, welcome along to Live on Air this Sunday evening. I've got with me Dr. Hester Cooper, and we're going to be talking about conservation community, and in particular the Hauraki Gulf island, Tiritiri Matangi. But before we talk about Tiritiri, Hester, tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Okay, 40 years a researcher and still a researcher. My background was undergraduate. I did home science and got interested in people and products, and I did a Masters in Consumer Studies in Canada, and then ended up doing my PhD when I was actually working in Palmerston North at Massey. Field is what's called sensory evaluation, which is how people interact with products through the senses, and apart from being curious about what consumers feel and do, I guess it teaches you a lot about experimental design and a lot about statistics, so that's where I come from.
Yeah, most fascinating background. Hester and I have known each other since the early 1990s. We're part of the same church group. And when I first found out about Hester's background, I was very interested to try to understand what it was that researchers would ask about sensory things. And I remember making the most terrible faux pas with Hester. I said something like, "Oh, I'm immune to advertising," and she just laughed and said, "No, you're not." And subsequently I found out, Hester, that you are absolutely right. I'm not immune to messages that come in all sorts of ways. But your research takes you into fascinating areas about human psychology and response. But it's specifically about how you got interested as personally in the work of Tiritiri Matangi and the conservation.
Okay, so I first visited Tiritiri Matangi in the early 90s, and I did a few visits. I really liked it. I was interested in wildlife, particularly birds, and then in the mid-90s I sort of got shoulder tapped by Barbara Walter, who organised the guides at that stage, and she was needing guides for the midweek. These days we have some pretty stalwart teams that come over during the week, but at that time she was a little bit short, and she said, would I become a guide? And I said, well, yes, I'd love to. The birds will be fine, but I think I'm going to have to do some work on the trees, Barbara. And so I started guiding fairly regularly for Barbara at that stage. And around that time, the biodiversity subcommittee of the society heard that I was a researcher, so they thought that maybe I could help them as a research advisor for applications for funding for research on Tiritiri. So that's when I started to get involved, and then gradually I got involved in the biodiversity subcommittee itself, and then I actually chaired that for 7 years, and then I became involved in the main committee, and I've rolled on since then on both the biodiversity subcommittee and on the main committee. So,
wow, so that's a very extensive, very long-term volunteer input into Tiritiri itself. You must enjoy the island immensely to keep that up.
Yes, and I'm not a real old stager. I mean, there are people who have been with the supporters since its inception, and it started in 1988. So we still have people who joined in 1988 and are still going. I mean, we have a couple of volunteers who come over regularly, probably almost once a week, who are 90. So we have long-term, I mean, you know, they obviously get something from the island. There is a reward for them. And yeah, we've been around a while.
And a lot of people that live in Auckland would have known Tiritiri, first of all, because it had the lighthouse, and at night it was one of the only, wasn't the only lighthouse in Auckland Harbour, Hauraki Gulf, but boy, that was one of the main ones. And I gather that the last lighthouse keeper that lived on Tiritiri has also become part of the community of volunteers.
Well, he is now, but Ray and Barbara came over. I mean, Ray came over with family in 1980, and he retired finally from Tiri in 2005. And he sometimes says that if he'd known he was going to spend 25 years there, he probably would have slit his throat immediately. But he was our last lighthouse keeper, because they were in the process when he came of automating the White Lighthouse. And he was our first warden and ranger, and he was our first and last nurseryman, so he developed the tree nursery on Tiri, and he's still very active within the supporters.
Right. Now, when you've got an island in the Hauraki Gulf that has undergone this extensive conservation overhaul, if I can put it that way, some very big conservation themes must have emerged out of it, including preservation of the historic buildings like the lighthouse and so on. But what, in your opinion, are the really big themes for Tiritiri?
Definitely community and community engagement. I mean, the vision of John Craig and Neil Mitchell, who first saw Tiri as very young lecturers at the University of Auckland, was that A, it be restored, but B, that it be a sort of open sanctuary. So it was the first place that became a place with rare species that was open to the public. I mean, conservation in those days, and you have to think back, was really the preserve of the professional ecologists and the wildlife officers. I mean, the public wasn't engaged. The public didn't get asked to plant trees. That was an entirely new concept. And even the idea of planting 280,000 trees was sort of laughed at, because nobody thought it could be done. It looks like quite a small project now when you look at the really big ones that are out there.
But there have been a number of things that have made Tiritiri Matangi unique in terms of conservation values. What are some of those aspects?
I mean, certainly the bringing to an island where people could see them of quite iconic and very rare species. So that's absolutely, and that was part of the vision of John and Neil, that species be brought where the public could see them, and that they be, wild on the island, but actually be seen by the public.
Does that mean that, say, if you're out boating as a private yachty or boatie in the Hauraki Gulf, you could go onto the island?
Absolutely. And that's quite rare, because we're a scientific reserve, which usually you require a permit for, and a scientific reserve is usually what it says. It's a place where scientists go. So no, boaties can go, and that's one reason we have rat traps on all the beaches.
So there's been a massive eradication program for rodents and...
we were lucky. We had only one pest species, and that was kiori.
The native rat.
The native rat. And a decision was made in 1993 to take them off. So yes, they were removed. Right.
And as a result, unique species of birds have begun to, maybe thrive isn't the right word, but their populations are growing. They're moving back from the brink.
Absolutely. And Ray reckoned that after the eradication, the food supply went up by 30%. So even if the rats were not physically taking out the birds, they were actually competing for food. So in that respect, they were certainly having a major effect.
It must also, there must be some other values that are associated with Tiritiri besides the introduction or replanting the trees and the introduction of some of these endangered species. Is there a kind of overall conservation theme or goal that guides you?
You can go and read our... I'm not sure if our strategic plan is up on the website yet, but it probably will be there soon. We place advocacy pretty much at the top of the tree for us. Advocacy and sanctuary, we've always said, kind of gazump other things. So even if a species is not strictly speaking supposed to be there, but we could provide sanctuary, we will do it. I think one of the nice things about Tiri is that people come to the island, they see what can be done, and they kind of go away slightly inspired to see what's going on in their own backyard. It's not about, oh, I better get involved with Tiri. It's like, oh, they did that. I wonder what we could do. And you only have to look at our record in New Zealand. I think there's something like somewhere over 4,000 conservation projects in New Zealand, and the vast majority of them are community-based.
So the sense of building a community is very important for the existing community to keep on building on that volunteer group.
I mean, one of our streams of income are the guided walks. Well, we have a roster of about 200 guides, but that rolls over at times. But so there's a real need to keep people interested and engaged and supported, and new ideas and all those things. I mean, we have guides who've been guiding I've been guiding for over 20 years. So,
besides guiding, there'd be people involved in other aspects of the project.
Absolutely. So the infrastructure group looks after major infrastructure sort of projects. Past projects have included the Visitor Centre, which was opened in 2005, and there's a large implement shed where all the tractors, etc. are kept. And at the moment we're moving our way towards some really major projects around a new field centre, a maritime museum, and even a replica of the signal mast. So a lot going on.
And so it's sort of conservation in the widest possible sense, isn't it? It's not just about the wildlife. Yeah.
Particularly with the maritime area, I mean, Ray Walter has all these contacts because he had been a lighthouse keeper from his 20s onwards, and the Tiri Lighthouse is one of the only that's been continuously lit since 1865. We celebrated the 150th anniversary in 2015. And there's an awful lot of history around those buildings. In most parts of New Zealand, once automation happened, most of those buildings went. They were surplus to requirement, they were demolished. So it's one of the few places in New Zealand where you've actually got lighthouse keeper cottages and other buildings around.
Oh, that's amazing. I'm just very curious about not the visitors that swarm in through the official boats coming in across the jetty, but the unofficial visitors, because even though it is a reserve and we can get on if we've got a means to get there. Does that mean that the area around the island is somehow protected for marine life, or is that a vision that would?
Not at present. It's suggested, there's a new plan for the Hauraki which includes marine reserves. It's certainly one of the suggestions there. We kind of take care of the island and leave the marine reserve to see what happens, shall we say. At the moment, not. No.
Well, that must be one of the really unique things about Tiritiri Matangi, is this partnership between this volunteer group, the trust board, etc., and I presume it's Department of Conservation, DOC.
Absolutely. So we have a relationship of co-management to actually work with DOC in terms of how things are managed. I mean, there are parts of it that are entirely DOC responsibility and will always be and should be, but there are other aspects where the volunteer, where the society actually works with DOC on those. And how do volunteers feel? Do they feel that they're empowered in a sense that they have become scientists in their own right to be able to participate in building up the reserves on the island? Well, I mean, to be quite frank, we have a number of scientists who are volunteers. Before the interview, I talked about the fact that I have a colleague who uses it's a term used now around citizen science, which is of people who are avocational, i.e. it's not necessarily their job, but they have high levels of skill in the area. But we also have ecology lecturers who volunteer, and we're doing an increasing number of projects where members of the society design them and set them up, and volunteers run them.
That's fantastic, isn't it? Because that's the kind of avenue that school kids, in the later stages of high school, they may have a particular career path prospect in mind and aren't going to study in that area, but they could also service, if you like, their hobby, their passion through this kind of work.
Absolutely. And I think the thing about those sorts of projects is it's about engaging our members and actually having them work on a project over a long period. If we look back on the translocations, there's often an intense period of monitoring once you translocate an animal, bird, whatever, to the island. But it's usually a fairly short-term thing. It's often a master's or a PhD, which means it's 1 year or 2 years field work, and then it just dies away. With volunteer groups, you've actually got, the luxury of a longitudinal study, of doing something quite long-term. The history of our planting is that we planted 90,000 pohutukawa. We were told that 1 in 3 would survive. About somewhere between 60 and 90% survived. So we ended up with an awful lot. And when they grow very close together, they don't flower. So they're kind of like a green desert, really. So we got permission in 2010 to cut some down, so we could see what would happen if we cut. Basically, the principle was, if you cut holes in a monoculture forest, what will happen? Will you improve the diversity? Will you? And so we've been monitoring that annually now since then. So that's, and people keep saying to me, how long is this going on for, Hester? And I say, well, 20 years probably, we'll just see what happens. So it's the potential to do that kind of length of study. Much lower potential usually, unless you have a university professor who just loves the species and wants to follow it for the next 25 years, in which case, you get that longitudinal study.
Well, since you mentioned pohutukawa, I think a kind of a hot topic at present is the myrtle rust disease that's blown over from either Australia or from somewhere around the Pacific. That must present an enormous threat to sanctuaries like Tiritiri and other places.
Yes, it does, and it's very much a wait and see at the moment. I see that there is now a suggestion that it may not survive well in colder temperatures, which may mean that it becomes an upper North Island problem rather than a lower North Island and South Island, which may mean that all those, what I consider inappropriate plantings of pohutukawa down around the Kapiti coast may well be our salvation. Who knows? I guess we also don't know what the genetic diversity of some species, myrtle species, is. So that's, at the moment, Rama seems to be the one that's most affected, and that's problematic because it's not that common and therefore may not have great genetic diversity. But for community projects where they've planted either a pohutukawa, as we have, or lots of kānaka and mānaka, we're all sitting there waiting rather tensely.
The vulnerability of places like Tiritiri Matangi must be, the risk management plan must be enormous in terms of trying to, you've got endangered species, you've got these kinds of unexpected threats, etc. For the average volunteer, how worrisome is all of that? Do they lose sleep at night over what might happen?
I doubt it. I hope they don't.
Yeah.
I think, the thing with conservation is you have to be optimistic that you can do something, that every little bit helps. And there was a very good editorial in the last Science, which is called Earth Optimism, and it talks about the fact that you can't engage people if you just give them bad stories. If you just tell them about all the doom, gloom and despair about conservation, they see no point in becoming engaged or helping. Why would they? And so they also sort of made the point that conservation all around the planet is actually about an accumulation of little advances. So it's a whole lot of little things, like it's every little thing we do helps.
Well, in a nutshell, that's the part of the success story of Tiritiri Matangi, isn't it? I mean, how many visitors do you get a year? Is it significant, say, in the Auckland scene?
Certainly if you compare us to the zoo, absolutely not. We're limited by the ferry. So Dock sets a limit of, I think it's 170 paying passengers on the ferry 5 days a week. That's it. Boaties, of course, they come and go at will. So there's a limit. So our normal range of visitors is sort of around 30 to 35,000 a year. But, it's certainly not hundreds of thousands, which it would be if we were land-based.
But I guess one of the key features of how popular it is the number one attraction on TripAdvisor and a number of other similar websites, I gather.
Yes. So, yes, we've been number one on TripAdvisor for a while. So if anybody wants to come, please book on the ferry. We hate to see people disappointed, and certainly during the summer months it gets very busy. So,
It's been a success story in ways that people would not have foreseen, because I think these, if you like, they're not public-private partnerships, but in a sense they are the professionals embracing the volunteers in ways that can not always be easy to begin with. But here we've got something, I believe, that you would say Tiritiri kind of blazed the way for this sort of volunteer group.
Well, certainly, I know when they even started planting trees, nobody had ever asked the public to come out with a spade and plant trees, basically. I mean, we take that for granted now. You think of all the planting projects around Auckland, and, being asked to go out for a planting day is kind of standard practice now.
Yeah, sort of across the waves from Tiritiri at the Long Bay Reserve, there's numerous volunteer days for planting out along the trail. You could rattle off probably a couple of dozen projects around Auckland. That you have a belief that people do need to do things in their own local community.
Well, we'd love you all to join Tiri supporters, but I mean, I guess, I think people are really engaged with their own backyard. And I asked a colleague at Auckland Council, I said, what can people do? And he said, well, make sure they haven't got any of the really bad weeds in their garden is a good starting point. That's a really but understanding which weeds in the Auckland area are really bad is a good thing. You sometimes see them in public places, and I've seen moth plant in public places, and it's one of the evil ones, as we call them. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, the agapanthus and watsonias and so on, which grace many garden borders, are terrible things for choking off other plants, aren't they?
Absolutely. And I suppose the ones we think about are things like pampas, because it blows on, everything that blows on the wind is a real problem for Tiri. We pay 2 abseilers thousands of dollars each year to abseil up and down our cliffs and check out for really nasty things that we really don't want on the cliffs. And boxthorn is another one, and mila minute, bone seed, some really bad ones here. Yeah. So.
Okay, let's just see whether our viewers have got any questions that they want to put to you, Hester. Well, we've had a couple of viewer responses, Hester, and there's a very interesting one from Max Thompson. He's asking, do you ever get problems between the bird species? Do they compete, or do anything?
Nature is about competition. Yes, we do. You try with a number of translocations to think about the species there and the species you're bringing on. And when all is said and done, Department of Conservation gives you the permit, so they have to look at what you've planned and decide whether it's appropriate for those species to be together. One species that's always quite tricky, although it needs conservation, is the weka, because it competes with a number of the other birds of a similar sort of size. We don't have any non-natural predators. People say to you, do you have any predators? And you say, you have to be quite careful and say we don't have any non-native ones. But we do have ruru, mupuk, and we don't have them resident. But harrier hawks have a range of anything up to 200k, so they can fly in, and when all is said and done, a bird sanctuary is a takeaway bar for a harrier hawk. So yes, we get birds predated.
Right. Well, that's a great answer and a great question. Hadn't even crossed my mind, Max, and so thanks for that answer, Hester. We, in a little viewer survey, we find that virtually everyone, when they're out walking or taking in a bit of nature in their own local area, does sort of rubbish patrol, and it's really encouraging to see this happening on so many North Shore beaches. Plastic must be one of the biggest problems that we face in all kinds of ways. Any comment about that, Hester?
I certainly, I appreciate all that everybody does, I think, in cleaning up, because, it's kind of, if we all pick up a little bit, it stops being a problem. If you want to see a great project about removing rubbish, go and look at the one where they cleaned up. A young man organised almost an army of people to help clean up about a 2k beach, I think it is, on the coast of Mumbai, and it was 7 feet deep in rubbish across the entire beach. It was just tons and tons and tons, and they now have a clean beach. So it can be done. And I think all conservation is about all of us doing a bit. It doesn't have to be dramatic. And that's where a lot of our community projects start. They start with somebody doing some simple trapping to get rid of rats and mice. And they grow from there. There's a project down in the Bay of Plenty at a place called Kaharoa, which is a remnant forest of about 300 hectares. And they had a very small population of kokako. And they started a trapping program. And they now have about 50 kokako. And if you go and visit their site, you'll find it says, basically, if you want to save the kokako, you kill the rats. It's very simple. We have a few bird species. Kokako is one of them. Keraru is another. Whio, the blue duck, is another. The female won't get off the nest. If she's on the nest with either eggs or chicks, she won't get off. So the predator gets her as well as any chicks or eggs. And that means you end up with populations where there's far too many males, and in some populations you may end up with male-only populations, which doesn't do anything for the breeding population. And kokako can kind of fool you because they will form male-male pairs, so they will pair up together if there are no females around.
Interesting. Okay, last, not so much a question, but a comment. Water has become the export of water in particular has become a kind of hot political potato in the upcoming election cycle. But if you were looking for a big conservation theme, leaving aside the politics, how do you feel about the fact that we're in a position where we do have to clean up waterways because of the very intense dairying effects? That's not quite the clean green image we would like to promote, is it?
No, it's not. And I think, again, all of these things are going to happen because a lot of people do a little bit. And, we go back at times and we kind of did away with plantings. In a funny kind of way, we sort of did what England did when they pulled the hedgerows out and then discovered they needed to put the hedgerows back. So we kind of have pulled all the trees and planting out and drained the swamps, and kind of we're realising that they're very valuable assets and we kind of need to do the restoration. Yeah,
it's terribly easy to just blame an industry for, this is the big bag bogey in a way. But in another sense, we've got to strike a responsible balance. And I think that water has become much more embedded in the Kiwi consciousness because of this election process. So along with that and the other big themes, the power of the volunteer, the uniqueness of Tiri. You've taken us on a fascinating journey, Hester, and I just want to say thank you very much indeed for coming in and recording with us tonight.
Thank you.
See you next week.